Hello and welcome to Newsclick. The government has on the 2nd of October launched with much fanfare the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan or the Clean India campaign. We've been treated to many grand promises along with photos of ministers, government employees and students sweeping dirt from one side of the street to the other. The obvious problem with this is that it all appears like a well-planned PR campaign. But is this a fair assessment of the program? To discuss the issue, we have with us Professor Salil Mishra from Ambedkar University here in Delhi. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now to start with, I'm naturally suspicious of such programs. There appears to be no systemic or well thought out method to deal with the issues surrounding cleanliness in India. So what is your take on the concept itself of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan? I mean, does the lack of specifics make you wary of this program?
Well, ideally, any such campaign should have three components. First is at the level of the state, massive resources at a very centralized level, use of modern technologies, investments of huge resources and so on and so forth, because there is no substitute to it. You have to do it through investments. Investments have to be done by the state. That's one. The second is local administration, civic bodies, civil administration, etc. Now, those have pretty much collapsed in our country, and much of the filth and the dirt in the cities is largely a result of that. As a part of this campaign, if these bodies could be reactivated, if they could be made more efficient, and if they could be made more accountable, then that would certainly make a difference. Once A and B, 1 and 2 happen, then the third will automatically be put in place, which is a kind of an attitudinal transformation, a change at the level of attitude, in which those who keep their houses clean will also learn to keep the roads, railway stations, bus stands and public places clean. So that will also happen. So there are these three components: investments by the state, reactivation of the local administration, civil bodies, and third is change in the attitude.
Now, actually just taking off on the first 2 points in particular that you mentioned, which I think are very, very important. We've seen over the last, I could say 10 years or maybe even more, a move towards privatizing a lot of these sectors, whether it's water distribution, so on and so forth. How do you see that actually affecting this issue which you clearly think is really important, the first issue you mentioned in terms of providing these sort of facilities to people in general? So that is my first question. And secondly, connected to that and the current patterns of economic development that we are seeing, or that our present government looks eager to engage in, or how does this plan to have increased economic activity and development in this current model go side by side with ensuring economic sustainability, cleanliness and so on?
Answer to your first question, whether government does there are certain essential activities which have to be performed by the government, whether the government does it itself or it delegates it to its own bodies or it delegates it to private bodies which have to be accountable to the government. It doesn't really matter very much, so long as these activities acquire a kind of a priority. They are important. They should not be relegated. They can be delegated to different bodies. On your second point, you see, it is true that much of the waste that we talk about or that we see, it's not really some traditional notion. It's very much, we need to put it in context. It's very much a part of modern economic history.
Absolutely.
It's product of industrialization, new industries, etc. All industries are by definition polluting. They create a certain kind of pollution. Now, in Europe, when it happened, it created tremendous amount of problems for the European cities, and European cities were dirty, they were filthy. 18th and 19th century, many people wrote on it, very humanizing stuff. Charles Dickens wrote on it, Karl Marx wrote on it, you know, these were shanty towns, there was a loss of soul, there was no humanity, no fellow feeling, dirt, filth all over. Now, that was a product of industrialization, and then in the 19th century in Europe, they started what is called a sanitary revolution. So, industrial revolution was also followed by a sanitary revolution, etc. So, if you see a certain cleanliness in modern cities, it's not because of modernity, it's because great efforts were made at the level of the state to keep them clean.
Problem is then that counts as a cost if you're actually going to put in effort and put in this sort of money rather than just relying on the goodwill of people to work towards cleanliness. It's actually going to be a cost, which ensures then that there's an economic loss in that sense, or something that previously was unfactored.
Absolutely. So it's not simply a question of attitude or habits and so on. I think this has to be looked at a different level. It's not just habits and attitudes. It's a question of structures and institutions and histories and priorities. Industrialism creates great profits. It creates affluence. But that affluence is meaningless if that comes at a huge social cost. Therefore, some part of that affluence created by industrialism has to inevitably be used towards keeping the social life livable, manageable. Therefore, in other words, keeping your cities clean and so on.
Now, previous attempts at beautification or cleanliness campaigns in India, whichever way you describe them, whether it's in Chennai, whether it's in Delhi before the Commonwealth Games, whether it's in Gujarat around the Sabarmati River and so on, have usually resulted in slums being cleared. I mean, so you have slums being located to parts of the city where the affluent or the middle classes can't view them, essentially, hidden away behind banners. Do you see this present campaign as just another extension of these sort of displacement campaigns, as I would call them?
There is a very serious risk of that. You see, all this drive, talk of cleanliness, etc., it also has what I would call an elite bias. I mean, I would not like to stretch this point beyond a point. I mean, cleanliness is in the interests of all. That is not to be doubted. But there is an elite bias. An elite bias has a kind of a contradiction. The contradiction is simply this. It's called a middle class. I would call it a middle class contradiction. You have money, so you buy a housing colony. When you buy a housing colony, then you need someone to clean your floor and someone to cook your food and someone to wash your car. In other words, you need a
support staff.
You need a support staff. Now, the support staff is obviously poor and they must come from nearby. So, much of this support staff comes from the jhuggi jhopadis, which mushroom almost as a consequence of the new colonies and the gated colonies and so on. It seems that those jhuggi jhopadis, they obviously cannot maintain themselves, they cannot practice your standards of cleanliness, and so then a kind of a resentment begins. And the resentment is against them, against their lifestyles, against their pollutions, etc. So there is a very dangerous, inhuman elite bias. They can be in these exercises, and I hope that does not happen.
Now, you've already mentioned how we need to use technology, and I mean, the government has already spoken of smart cities and so on. But at the same time, so you have on one hand this vision of having smart cities, but at the same time you have the reality of manual scavenging and other equally abhorrent practices in India. So how do you square these sort of the practice and the vision? And do you see any, for instance, caste elements also coming into this? You've already mentioned the concept of an elite looking at the situation in a particular way and therefore finding a particular way to deal with the situation, which is by getting rid of these lower classes, as it were. But surely there must be a caste relation there.
There is both. First, of course, the scavenging it's not just an activity in which the marginalized people are involved. That it is, but not just that. It's also very unsafe. It's very hazardous as an activity, and therefore manual handling of it tends to take its toll on the lives and the health of the people who are involved in it. And that is why we have to look at the West. I mean, there are technologies available. These are expensive technologies, but there are technologies that are run by human beings, but these machines which do the job, and sooner or later we have to opt for that. We have to opt for mechanization. So that is the simple way out. If you want your cities clean, then get the technologies which do some of the cleaning.
But doesn't that lead to the obvious problem, of loss of livelihood for these people? Because they're not going to be in a position to be using mechanized...
No, it does not. You see, this notion that mechanization replaces human beings, it has turned out not to be very true, because there are a whole range of ways in which humans are employed. But the caste factor...
It must come with upskilling then, surely.
That's absolutely. The caste factor is also important, because traditionally our caste system has rested on notions of pure and impure, purity and pollution, a hierarchy of jobs, certain jobs being superior to certain other jobs, therefore a ranking and a hierarchy. And which is why I think the way Gandhi practiced his cleanliness, his main idea was to emphasize the dignity of labor. Once you do something with your own hands, then you tend to impart dignity to that job because you can empathize with it. So dignity of labor is one way in which caste distinctions or caste hierarchies can be dealt a severe blow. They can be taken care of. So I don't know whether that will happen or not, but there is a very good potential in this campaign of also weakening the institutions of caste and the structures of caste.
So are there actually any specific plans to, improve the conditions of laborers, whether it's, actually, or even say municipal corporation laborers who are very often on contract? I'm not even talking about, laborers who are in particularly bad situations like your manual scavengers.
You see, the thing about this campaign is that nobody knows what the content is. I hope there is a content, but it has not been made clear. I'm sure there is a blueprint, there is a roadmap, there is a vision, there must be some components, something must be written down, allocation of resources, which activity is going to get what resources, which activity is going to get what priority over what. I hope it is there. I am assuming that it's there, but it has not really been made public. So nobody seems to know what this campaign is all about, except this symbolism that was on display.
Would you then agree if I said that the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan essentially has no systemic plans as such, other than a call for people to do 2 hours of Shramdan a year? Or
if it has, we do not know about it. I sincerely hope that it has a component, that it has a content, that it has a blueprint, that it has a roadmap, that there are resources that are going to be used for it, that there are technologies that are going to be used. I don't know it. Nothing has been made clear. I hope it's there, because then it is capable of showing some results. But as of now, it doesn't look that there is any significant content in it, apart from this shell, apart from this form. It has acquired a form. The form was visible. There was a great pomp and show. There was a great display on the 2nd of October.
Now, a last question, something you've alluded to already. I mean, how do you generally explain the lack of civic sense in India? I mean, we all know that Indian men in particular love peeing and spitting in public and so on. But at the same time, I mean, as you mentioned, we have a fairly developed sense of personal hygiene. I mean, so what explains this difference in how we treat the personal and how we treat the public? I mean, it's often seen, or seen most obviously, in how people will clean up their own houses and then immediately go and dump the garbage right outside on the road. Isn't this something that this changing social attitudes is required to change something like that?
This is a problem, definitely a problem. It's a problem of the mind, of the attitude, but I would still say it's relatively less important. You see what happened, there are important cities. Singapore is one example, where a good civic sense was virtually drilled into people through a very coercive kind of a system. Heavy penalties, if you drove badly, your license was taken away from you. If you spat, or if you were found urinating, then there were, great penalties, great fines and so on. So it was out of a very coercive system. It was almost out of a fear of law that this happened. I would be happier if this outcome is achieved more through voluntary work, more through internalization, more through realizations. And I think that will happen once people see that the civic bodies, the local administration is very sincere and serious in keeping our public spaces clean. So if there are visible efforts to see that our roads, our railway stations, our bus stands, all public places are absolutely being kept spick and span, then people become stakeholders in it. People develop a pride, and once they develop a pride, then they take care to maintain it.
I've actually noticed that in the Delhi metro, I think, where a lot of people found that you had this wonderful, shiny new service, and they were proud of being Delhiites in a sense.
I feel that this should happen. It would happen, even the change of the mind, but I hope this outcome is achieved not so much through coercion and through rules and regulations. Little bit of rules and regulations are fine, they are needed, but it happens more through self-realization, voluntary work, and more through a change of attitude.
Well, that's an optimistic note to end this interview on. That's all the time we have today. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.